What are some of the creepiest declassified documents made available to the public? Story 1. Sweden had a compulsory sterilization program running from 1935 to 1979. It was state-sanctioned and given without consent, sometimes without the people knowing they were being sterilized. The three main reasons for these sterilizations were health concerns for the mother, eugenic, not wanting to pass on mental illness or any form of handicap, social, antisocial people, criminals, drunks, etc. In other words, anyone who didn't conform properly and was considered unfit to raise children. Story 2. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness, necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. It's incredibly hard to find Dahmer's confession online without it being behind a paywall, but it is in the public domain. Dahmer was caught just after I had read Silence of the Lambs. A central plot point of the book is that they catch a serial killer by profiling him. One of their tenets, proved correct in the book, is that the guy must have his own relatively isolated house to himself, or he couldn't get away with what he was doing. Then Dahmer is busted after years of living in an apartment building where everybody complained about the smell of rotting meat, and where the police actually brought his victims back to him. Story 3. The CIA was working on a heart attack gun back in the 1960s to the 1970s. It started off as a conspiracy theory, but gained enough momentum nationwide that it forced the US government's hand, and they finally admitted the theory was mostly accurate. Short version, they never had a fully functional heart attack gun, but they did have a nearly working prototype. The idea was that it would have a very small projectile that would be laced with a chemical that would induce a heart attack, and leave a hole smaller than the one left behind by a syringe. While they never had a fully working version, they did have a prototype, but abandoned the project once they more or less had to admit the conspiracy was mostly true. I find this to be among the creepiest and scariest things declassified by the government, simply because of the consequences of them admitting to having been working on such a weapon. If they were working on it that far back, they probably have something working by now, or the tech was rolled into another project at least. We can't even dream just what the US intelligence/military is truly capable of. They've had trillions every year for decades, and we see very little of what comes from all that R&D. It's really scary to think about just how far ahead their tech really is. Story 4. Project 1794. Top secret program with the US Air Force working on a Canadian aeronautics company to build a supersonic flying saucer-like aircraft that would be able to simultaneously wage psychological war on our Cold War enemies, as well as physical war. It was also designed to be a bomber. The project was scrapped when they figured out that not only would it be too expensive to build enormous flying discs, but also that crafts of that shape were near impossible to fly at supersonic speed. Story 5. The case of Hisashi Ouchi. He was a Japanese nuclear power plant worker who was exposed to a lot of radiation, which left him looking like a Fallout ghoul. They kept him alive for 3 months even though he was in a lot of pain. His heart even stopped 3 times in an hour, but they kept on resuscitating him. I don't know much about it, but it is interesting to read about. Story 6. Operation LAC 1957 to 1958. The U.S. Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide in primary African American areas of St. Louis to test the dispersion of geographic range of bio or chem attacks. It's considered a probable human carcinogen. The Pentagon maintains to this day that no one got ill from it, but residents and leaders of St. Louis speak differently. This only got widespread exposure after Missouri's 2 senators demanded the declassification of the project about 10 years ago. Story 7. A man named Joseph McMoneagle claimed that he had an unusual talent known as remote viewing, where he had the ability to see the world through another person's eyes at any physical place and any place and time. The CIA ran a test on him in 1984 where they tried to discredit his ability. They gave him a piece of paper with coordinates and a date and time written on it and told him to tell what he saw. The catch was, the coordinates were on Mars, and the date was 1,000,000 years in the past. However, to their surprise, when McMoneagle began to describe what he saw, he described unfamiliar landscape, and said that he viewed a civilization in dire state. He then went on to describe complex infrastructure spanning the strange landscape, such as roads, aqueducts, channels, and pyramids. He described the entities that he saw as tall, shadowed figures. and it appeared that their situation was critical and on the brink of apocalypse. The CIA declassified the entire transcript, which can be read by anyone online. Story 8. Pretty much anything related to Marie Curie. She discovered radium, coining the term radioactivity, and suffered greatly for it. There's lots of documentation on how horribly she died, including her own testimony to the first-hand experience of radiation poisoning. Story 9. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and Department of Defense have long histories of involvement with Hollywood media, from sponsorships and to direct consultations. Alford 2017, Redmond 2017. A declassified memo titled The Motion Picture as a Weapon of Psychological Warfare from the CIA's persecutor, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS 1947, stated its main objective was to exploit the potentialities of the motion picture as a weapon of psychological warfare for the United States, P1. It went on to detail potentialities relating to influencing thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes, providing extensive recommendations to coordinate with the film industry in the interest of psychological warfare. Story 10. Soviet Union's Cannibal Island. In the 1930s, the Soviet government decided to send thousands of undesirables to a swampy river island called Nazino with nothing to survive on but bags of flour. People tried mixing the flour with river water, and this resulted in outbreaks of dysentery. Eventually, people started eating corpses and later on killing other people for food. There was no leaving the island, since the guards would shoot you if you tried. Eventually, the settlement was dissolved, and the 2,800-plus survivors were sent to smaller settlements upstream. All of this was kept secret by the government until 1988, when the Glasnost policy was introduced and the details were made public. Story 11. Nuremberg trials transcripts. The trials of medical personnel were particularly bad. One example: they were trying to make poison bullets. To test them, they would select Russian POWs and shoot them in the hip with a rifle. To be scientific, they had controls, so they'd shoot one guy with a regular bullet and a couple with poison bullets, then watch them, making medical observations the entire time to see how long it took them to die. Edit. Also look up the documents on Japanese Unit 731 in China, then find the unclassified documents on what the Allies did with the doctors that participated in Unit 731. The good old days weren't so great. Story 12. Pedro Albizu Campos was arrested a third time and imprisoned for 26 years for working to make Puerto Rico independent by the American government. The cause was that members of the Nationalist Party shot in Congress and unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, illegal to do at that time. He wasn't there, but he was the head of the Nationalist Party, and the American government had been keeping an eye on him for years. While in prison, his health deteriorated, and he said that they were using radiation to kill him in his cells. No one believed him until folders used by the American government to keep tabs on the Puerto Rican people were declassified in the late 90s. There it was found that they were using radiation to kill him, and him, being as smart as he was, tried to slow the poisoning slowly by covering himself with wet towels, giving the nickname King of the Towels by his jailers. That's just one of the many crimes Americans have done against the Puerto Rican people, all public now when these documents were declassified. Story 13. I'll just throw in a couple for you. Project MKUltra. To summarize, you know Stranger Things. Basically, this is the main inspiration for that. Alternatively, you could compare it to Deadpool's origins, human experimentation to find superpowers. Yeah. Chernobyl could have been stopped. Also this page. Flaws in the construction were known about. By extension, various smaller nuclear accidents in the USSR didn't get revealed to the public, including those in the vicinity of the reactors, until notably later. And perhaps most worrying of declassified documents is the Dugway sheep incident. About 6,000 sheep just died. It was possibly due to an aerial release of nerve agents, but even that explanation isn't perfect, as some other animals were fine, and some sheep showed symptoms inconsistent with nerve gas exposure. Story 14. Journalist Dmitry Koledov was blown to bits while investigating Russian military corruption, with a briefcase he had been told contained leaked documents. As a witness in trial some years later, Pavel Grachev, who had been defense minister at the time of Koledov's murder, said, "Some of my subordinates misunderstood my words." Story 15. Not safe for life. The UK declassified documents in 2012 confirming stories of mass incarceration during rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s. The Mau Mau were a group that included essentially every citizen in Kenya. Personal accounts from Kenyans depicted widespread torture and massacre by UK officials to get Kenyans to denounce the Mau Mau. Possibly one of the most brutal accounts of torture I heard was a story from a man describing how he was held down while UK officials sodomized him with a stick to force sand inside of him. Pretty dark and f***ed up shit. After some time, the UK decolonized Kenya and put into powers that denied the events ever occurred and denounced the Mau Mau. The world saw a peaceful transition to an independent country. Story 16. Recently, the U.S. declassified that the Gulf of Tonkin incident that incited our involvement in the Vietnam War was completely falsified and that American forces were never actually fired upon. This was the triggering event that led to thousands upon thousands of lives being lost, and it was a bold-faced lie to manipulate the American people by a corrupt government. This was the same time frame where college protesters to the war were shot and killed for opposing it. The government made up a war and killed people who didn't want to follow the lies like the brain-dead war machine it wanted them to be a part of. Just a side note about that as well, the man behind the Gulf of Tonkin incident was Jim Morrison, of The Doors' father. In fact, a lot of the famous musicians and individuals in the hippie movement at that time had fathers that were high-ranking military or involved with government. Kind of weird. Story 17. The East German Stasi files. Files from Communist Germany's notorious secret police have been available to the public since 1992. The Stasi, one of the most effective intelligence organizations of the Cold War, kept an eye on every aspect of life inside East Germany, spying on its own citizens and keeping extensive files on millions of them. The Stasi tried to destroy the files when the wall fell in '89, but East German citizens were able to save them when they stormed into the Stasi offices. Story 18. Toolbox Killers. Aptly named for the paraphernalia they used to commit heinous acts that could be found in any toolbox. I won't list their names. Their sobriquet is sufficient to identify them, but their victims were Shirley Lynette Ledford, Jackie Doris Gilman, Jacqueline Leah Lamp, Andrea Joy Hall, and Lucinda Lynn Schaefer. They were all subjected to protracted torture, mutilation of the bodies and genitals. Gilman had an ice pick thrust through his ears, relentless blunt trauma to the head and torso, strangulation via a coat hanger, and pliers. Story 19. Documents about the mass graves in Denmark in case of a nuclear war. During 1978, the authorities in Denmark started to designate places where bodies could be buried in case of a war between the US and the Soviet Union. These places were chosen on criteria of being able to drive to the location and if radiation would reach the groundwater. One tabloid did write about this, and the national TV station did interview the mayor of the municipal where one of the mass graves were to be located, and he quietly confirmed that an area had been chosen. Looking back at those documents and then comparing them with the Soviet plan called 7 Days to the River Rhine, Denmark were to be bombed with at least 5 nuclear devices. The preparations were good. Story 20. The Manhattan Project declassified documents show that Japan was desperate to surrender about 1 month before we dropped the first bomb. They relayed the message to the US through Russia. We dropped the bombs anyway to test how geography affected radiation. Hiroshima was on an open plain and Nagasaki was in a valley. The two cities were also some of the only cities not hit by previous bombings, so all the destruction would be only from the atomic bombs and give better data. Story 21. A personal favorite is the High Frequency Global Communication System. The HFGCS covers a lot, but what is particularly interesting is that it manages emergency alert messages sent via shortwave on the frequencies 8992 kHz and 11175 kHz. This is basically an American numbers station. The messages are usually sent to a nuclear asset on standby and they are coded. The most common call sign is called the Sky King, although the traffic has been more varied recently. It's a little bone-chilling to hear a long string of messages being sent to assets that could potentially end life on Earth as we know it. To keep the assets safe, they do not respond to keep themselves from being tracked. Hearing the phrase, Sky King, do not answer," always makes my spine tingle. Story 22. The young woman that worked in the factories that painted watch dials in self-luminous paint full of radium. These girls were told that the paint was harmless, and they were also told to use their mouth to make the paintbrush a fine point, because using a rag or water took too much time and wasted too much paint. Since the paint was harmless and glowed in the dark, the young women would also paint their nails, lips, teeth, and face with it. Then they started getting sick, suffering from anemia, bone fractures, and necrosis of the jaw, also called radium jaw. The young women began a lawsuit against the radium paint company. Even the inventor of radium paint, Dr. Savin von Schockhauke, offered to help them in court because he was suffering from radium poisoning also. He died in 1928 from it. Ultimately, the women won their lawsuit. The lawsuit led to the enactment of government regulations for labor safety and ultimately contributed greatly to the development of OSHA in the U.S. The lawsuit and resulting publicity was a factor in the establishment of occupational disease labor law. Radium dial painters were instructed in proper safety precautions and provided with protective gear. In particular, they no longer shaped paintbrushes by the lip and avoided ingesting or breathing the paint. Story 23. Operation Condor. Literally a 101 manual made by the CIA used to teach military governments how to subdue the communist threat. From torture methods to interrogation and even political moves, this operation resulted in leaving not only a massive scar in South America in their history, but also one of the many causes why these countries have economical issues up to this day. USA not even tried to deny it, they just implemented the Kirkpatrick Doctrine recognizing military dictatorship and their brutality and ignorance as long as they were not communist. Story 24. The Dyatlov Pass incident refers to the unsolved deaths of 9 ski hikers in the northern Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, now Russia, between February 1st and February 2nd of 1959. The experienced trekking group, who were all from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, had established a camp on the slopes of Koholtsikal, in an area now named in honor of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. During the night, something caused them to tear their way out of their tents and flee the campsite while inadequately dressed for heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures. One of the hikers whose body was later found had no eyes and its tongue was cut out. Story 25. Unit 731 was a research and development unit in the Japanese Imperial Army which undertook lethal human experiment from 1935 to 1945 in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The victims of these experiments were subjected to a variety of horrors, including rape and forced pregnancy. They stated purpose was to test the transmission of syphilis and how it would affect potential offspring. Infected and non-infected prisoners were forced at gunpoint to engage in intercourse, often in grotesque and inhumanizing conditions. The guards themselves did this to prisoners as well. It is possible that the guards performed experiments on the infants born as well, in some cases their own children. Frostbite and starvation. Prisoners' appendages and limbs were removed to see how long they could survive. Executions. The guards used flamethrowers, grenades, and chemical or biological weapons on the victims. The Americans granted the army total immunity following the war and the victims. Even the guards' testimony was dismissed as communist propaganda. The Soviets prosecuted select members for war crimes. Story 26. Project Acoustic Kitty was pretty weird and creepy if you think about how things would be if they were successful. Basically, the CIA wanted to put microphones and transmitters inside of cats and use them to spy on the Soviets in the 1960s. It cost about $20 million and was a huge failure. But the thought of my own pet being used to spy on me is pretty unsettling. Story 27. During World War II, the U.S. government did radically specific tests on groups of soldiers who were locked into sealed rooms and exposed to mustard gas. The Defense Department was trying to see how useful the gas was and if it would be particularly effective against certain racial groups. The soldiers were sworn to secrecy, denied long-term medical care, and told that if they divulged these tests, even to their family or their own doctors, they'd be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible. This was uncovered by some NPR reporters and was detailed in this excellent but terrifying podcast, which has many other really interesting stories. Story 28. The leaked Russian documents detailing their weapon with the code name Poseidon. A well-earned name, mind you. It's a torpedo with a 200 megaton payload, 4 times more than the largest nuke ever detonated, which when detonated produces a highly radioactive tsunami wave that's 1,500 feet tall and supposedly could wipe out all life within 1,000 miles of the detonation. There currently is no way to defend against it that we know of. The Russians have 30 of these. The only major American city that the Russians couldn't destroy is Minneapolis, but their other 7,000 nukes could take care of that. Story 29. Previous king of the UK, Edward VII, visited Germany in 1937 and had a personal tour of the work camps led by Hitler himself. He plotted with Germany to be reinstated on the throne to replace his brother George VI, who was king at the time. The royal family denied all knowledge and hid the evidence until they were one day released when the documents were found by someone who worked at the archive where they were kept. Story 30. The Tuam babies in Ireland. Unwed mothers had their children taken at birth, and they were either illegally adopted by rich American couples, or they were more or less neglected until they died and put in massive graves. This was sadly only about 60 years ago.